Rowan and Eliza Waverley were the couple everyone envied. Charming, successful, and inseparable. Until Eliza launched a chilling campaign of psychological warfare that shattered Rowan's life from the inside out, turning love into a weapon, and marriage into a trap. To the outside world, the Thompson family seemed like a picture of suburban happiness. Their home, tucked into the tree-lined streets of Evergreen, Colorado, always looked warm and inviting. James Thompson was a dedicated high school math teacher, known for his patience with students and love of chess. Claire, his wife, ran a small but successful online vintage store from home. They had 2 children, both in elementary school, and a Labrador that greeted every visitor with a wagging tail. Neighbors often saw the family walking together in the evenings or hosting backyard barbecues on weekends. If there was any trouble inside that house, no one noticed it. But behind closed doors, the smiles began to fade. In the early months of 2018, James noticed a shift in Claire. At first, it was small things, sharp remarks about his clothes, the way he chewed his food, or how much time he spent at work. She insisted he was being selfish, that he wasn't present enough at home, and that she carried the burden of parenting alone. James tried to be more supportive, more involved. He changed his schedule, came home earlier, even started helping with her online business. Still, nothing he did seemed to be enough. Over time, Claire's criticisms turned into constant surveillance. She began questioning everything James did, where he went, who he spoke to, how long he took to run errands. She accused him of hiding things, of being dishonest, even when he gave her every detail of his day. She installed apps on his phone, disguised as family organizers, but really designed to track his location. She checked his emails, went through his drawers, and counted his cash. When James confronted her, she claimed it was necessary, that she didn't feel safe, that she needed to know he wasn't betraying her trust. At school, James remained calm and composed, but inside, he was unraveling. He didn't want to tell his friends or colleagues what was happening. He felt embarrassed, confused, and guilty, like he had somehow failed his wife and family. He told himself she was just going through a difficult time. Maybe it was postpartum stress. Maybe she was depressed. He promised to be patient, to give her space, to fix things. But as months passed, Claire's behavior only grew more erratic. One evening, James came home to find all the family photos removed from the walls. Claire said she didn't like looking at them anymore. Another day, he found his clothes in garbage bags by the door. She said she needed space and accused him of trying to control her. Yet the very next morning, she acted as though nothing had happened. This cycle of emotional whiplash left James constantly on edge, walking on eggshells in his own home. It wasn't just about arguments anymore. It was psychological warfare, subtle, constant, and wearing him down inch by inch. What James didn't know was that Claire's actions weren't random or emotional. They were calculated. Every word, every accusation, every staged outburst was part of a slow, deliberate plan. And the real destruction hadn't even begun. By early 2019, James was barely holding himself together. The home that once gave him comfort now felt like a hostile environment. Claire's behavior had become more volatile, yet somehow more controlled. She stopped shouting during arguments and instead used a calm, detached tone that made James feel like he was going insane. She accused him of raising his voice when he hadn't. She told friends and family he was emotionally abusive, planting seeds of doubt that began to grow outside the walls of their home. Then came the first false accusation. One rainy night in February, Claire called the police. She claimed James had grabbed her arm during an argument and threatened her. Officers arrived at the house while James was reading to their youngest child. He was handcuffed in front of his kids and taken away without understanding what had just happened. At the station, he insisted it was a misunderstanding. No marks were found on Claire, and there were no witnesses. The charges were dropped 2 days later, but the arrest record remained. James returned home to find that Claire had told the neighbors and the school community that she feared for her life. Word spread quickly. Parents at his school started emailing the administration, some even requesting their children be transferred to different classes. Although no formal complaint was filed, the principal quietly removed James from extracurricular duties and recommended he take a short leave to let things calm down. James complied, still unsure how things had spiraled so fast. He believed if he just gave Claire space, everything would return to normal. He was wrong. While James stayed with his brother for a few weeks, Claire moved fast. She opened new credit cards in his name and began transferring money from their joint account to an account he didn't know existed. She intercepted mail, redirected bank statements, and forged James's signature on loan applications. She started creating a financial profile of him as reckless and unstable. On paper, James was slowly becoming a man living beyond his means, debt-ridden, irresponsible, and unpredictable. Claire even created fake email addresses, pretending to be James, and used them to send rude messages to school administrators. One day, the school board received a profanity-laced email supposedly written by James, criticizing the principal. Fortunately, the IT department traced the IP address to his home, not to James's workplace. But even then, the damage lingered. Doubts were forming. People began to wonder, could Claire be telling the truth after all? James tried to piece things together, but nothing made sense. His accounts were being flagged. His credit score was tanking. He received calls about unpaid bills he never remembered incurring. He couldn't prove anything yet, but he knew something was deeply wrong. Still, he hesitated to accuse Claire. He couldn't imagine the mother of his children doing something so malicious. The idea seemed too dark, too calculated. But Claire had already made her next move. She wasn't finished, not even close. In 2020, James made the quiet decision to fight back, not through confrontation, but by seeking the truth. He needed answers to explain the chaos that had taken over his life. He had always been logical, someone who believed in evidence and reason. Now, he was in the middle of a situation that made no sense, and the only way to survive was to start documenting everything. He purchased a small hidden camera and placed it in his home office, where Claire rarely went. He also began saving emails, screenshots, and voicemails. His goal wasn't revenge, it was to understand what was happening and protect himself from whatever was coming next. What James discovered was worse than anything he imagined. The camera caught Claire sitting at his desk late at night, logging into his accounts and editing emails. She would carefully delete and rewrite messages, some to make it look like James was unprofessional at work, others to appear as though he was writing angry messages to friends and colleagues. She fabricated records of arguments they never had, and rehearsed false statements to tell others. In one chilling recording, she practiced crying before making a phone call, adjusting her voice until it sounded just broken enough to be believable. James was stunned. He had spent years trying to keep peace in a marriage he believed was just troubled. But this wasn't about miscommunication or stress. Claire was actively trying to destroy his life, and doing it with cold, clinical precision. The recordings showed her monitoring his activity, discussing ways to prove he was unstable, and even planning to create more scenarios that would make him look dangerous or irresponsible. Armed with this evidence, James reached out to a lawyer. The legal process was slow, and Claire's manipulations had already eroded much of his credibility. But the lawyer assured him that what he had captured was a solid start. Still, Claire seemed to anticipate his every step. Before James could take formal action, she made another calculated move. In the summer of 2020, Claire staged what she called a breakdown. She admitted herself to a private mental health facility, telling the staff that James had emotionally tortured her for years. She described fictional events with vivid details, showing bruises from months earlier, and claiming they were signs of abuse. She referenced fake emails and incidents she had fabricated over the last year. The staff, unaware of her manipulative history, filed a report against James with the local authorities. Almost overnight, James lost what little stability he had left. The school suspended him pending the outcome of the investigation. His teaching license was placed under review. Friends stopped calling. His children, still living with Claire, were now hearing stories about their father that painted him as a monster. He wasn't allowed near his home, and the judge temporarily restricted his custody rights until the case could be reviewed. James, who had spent years building a reputation of integrity, now found himself alone, accused, and under suspicion. And through it all, Claire remained calm, collected, and one step ahead. As 2021 began, James was living in the shadow of a life he no longer recognized. His career was stalled, his children were slipping away from him, and the community that once respected him now watched with quiet suspicion. He had done everything by the book, documented the lies, hired a lawyer, submitted the footage, and yet Claire's narrative continued to dominate. She was seen as the fragile, resilient mother trying to hold things together. James was the alleged villain, painted by carefully crafted stories and strategic performances that had left even professionals convinced. But not everyone was fooled. Ethan, Claire's cousin, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with her behavior over the past year. They had once been close, but lately, Claire's stories about James seemed exaggerated, rehearsed even. Her emotional reactions never felt genuine, and she often contradicted herself without realizing it. At a family gathering, she casually mentioned details about James's supposed threats. Details Ethan knew could only be made up. Something didn't sit right with him. Ethan decided to look deeper. He reached out to James quietly, unsure of what he'd find. What James shared stunned him. The footage of Claire falsifying emails, audio recordings where she rehearsed lies, and financial records showing clear manipulation. Ethan was horrified. He had grown up with Claire, but he never imagined she was capable of something so destructive. Motivated by a sense of justice and guilt, he decided to take action. Ethan hired a private investigator with experience in domestic fraud and psychological abuse cases. The investigator began tracing Claire's digital footprint, uncovering more disturbing details. Years before meeting James, Claire had filed a restraining order against a former boyfriend in another state. The man disappeared from public life shortly afterward, and Claire had told everyone he was dangerous. But the investigator found inconsistencies in her statements from that time as well. There were no police records of violence, only her word and a handful of dramatic emails, similar in tone to the ones she now attributed to James. The investigator also uncovered edited voice recordings that Claire had compiled over time. Using audio manipulation software, she had spliced together phrases from James's actual conversations to create clips that made him sound angry, even threatening. The plan was clear. She was preparing to release these recordings as further proof of her fabricated abuse claims. Ethan took everything: videos, emails, audio files, and the investigators' findings and submitted them to both James's attorney and the district attorney's office. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. A case was built not only around Claire's lies, but around her long-term, calculated abuse of systems meant to protect real victims. Prosecutors launched a formal investigation into Claire's actions, and the tide began to turn. For the first time in years, James felt a small glimmer of hope. The walls that had closed in around him were starting to crack, and though the damage done to his life was immeasurable, he now had something he hadn't had in a long time. Proof. Proof that he wasn't crazy. Proof that he wasn't the abuser. Proof that Claire had created a carefully constructed hell and made him live in it. In early 2022, the investigation into Claire's actions moved quickly. Once the authorities reviewed the overwhelming evidence Ethan had helped gather, they realized the full scope of her deception. Claire had not just manipulated her husband, she had misled police, medical professionals, and legal authorities, all while maintaining a flawless public image. What made it even more disturbing was how long she had kept up the act without slipping. Every email, every false report, every financial decision had been carefully plotted. It wasn't impulsive or chaotic. It was deliberate. Detectives began contacting those who had been part of Claire's narrative. Friends, neighbours, even school officials who had spoken out against James. When presented with the unedited footage and forensic analysis of the doctored audio files, many were stunned. What they thought had been a tragic case of domestic abuse was, in fact, an elaborate fabrication. The manipulated recordings were especially damning. Expert analysis showed audio splices, inconsistent background noises, and phrasing that didn't match James's speech patterns. Once pristine in her deception, Claire now stood exposed. Prosecutors charged her with multiple felonies: identity theft, fraud, obstruction of justice, perjury, and filing false police reports. In court, her carefully built persona unraveled. Her own digital footprint betrayed her. Timestamps on her devices matched perfectly with moments she had claimed James was present and violent. In reality, he had been at work, on surveillance cameras, or on the phone with colleagues. The lies didn't just collapse, they disintegrated under the weight of the truth. James was called to testify. His appearance in court was quiet, solemn. He didn't speak with anger, but with a kind of weary clarity. The courtroom listened as he described the years of confusion, fear, and mental exhaustion. He recounted how he had questioned his own reality, doubted his own memory, and endured the pain of losing time with his children. The recordings and documents were presented, and even the jury, initially uncertain, began to grasp the full horror of what had been done to him. Claire, for her part, remained mostly emotionless during the trial. She didn't break down. She didn't confess. Her calm demeanor, once convincing, now read as cold detachment. A psychologist called by the prosecution suggested that Claire displayed traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and a pattern of pathological lying. While that didn't excuse her actions, it gave some context to her behavior, how she could so convincingly play the victim while destroying someone else's life. The trial concluded with a conviction on all major charges. Claire was sentenced to 18 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least 12. The judge remarked that her actions were among the most calculated and cruel abuses of trust the court had ever seen. James, while relieved, didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching someone he once loved be taken away in handcuffs, but there was peace in knowing the nightmare had finally ended. With time, James slowly began rebuilding. His teaching license was reinstated. He was granted full custody of his children. And though the scars from Claire's betrayal would never fully fade, he had something stronger now: freedom, truth, and the strength of having survived the worst kind of lie.